Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our live Q&A on Facebook. Hope that you're all having a wonderful evening. It's been great. The weather is nice, and we're going to be talking about trees. Steve Clark is joining me, and this is all part of the climate change working party for Weston-super-Mare Town Council. And we pulled together interesting people, especially the local ones that know about stuff that's going on in our local area, because then you get to learn things about things that are going on. And that's why we've got Steve that's joining us now. So Steve, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because, like I said, a lot of your work involves really long words, and you're going to be far better at explain what it is that you do than I will. So fire away.
Well, hopefully not too many long words, but so I'm a chartered forester and an arboricultural consultant, which basically means that I look after trees. I know whenever you ask or say to someone, "Oh, you're an expert on your subject," they always come back with the line about an expert is a former drip under pressure. But in the line of trees, there's so much to know and so much to learn, and it's such an rapidly evolving subject that all I can say is that I have been involved with trees for 30 years and every day is a school day.
Yeah, so we could count the rings then. You would have 30 of your rings.
You could definitely count the rings, and you could see a few what we would call features of my sister from various events in my tree life. So I started out with a local tree company in Bristol about 35 years ago, and I'd actually studied environmental science at university and done some work in environmental education, and then when the recession hit in the 80s, that work dried up, and I had looked at doing some work training people in the environment, but realized that actually I needed some practical experience. So I started working as a landscaper, and the recession hit the landscape business, and the landscape company was part of a larger tree business, and they said, "The only work we've got for you is dragging branches. Are you interested?" And I went, "Yep." And that was the start of a long involvement with trees. And so for quite a few years I was on the gangs. I wasn't the best tree surgeon in the world. I'm a little bit too afraid of heights to do the big stuff, and I'm a bit slow to do things at a commercial rate. So I specialized in organizing the teams, keeping the machinery going, getting everything organized on the ground, and keeping the real tree surgeons happy. And eventually moved into the office and managed a couple of businesses, and then was introduced to the academic side of arboriculture, and took my first arboricultural qualifications, and very soon was out in the world surveying trees for local authorities, private landowners.
And that led you to the door of Weston-super-Mare Town Council.
It did. After a long time, after years and years, I ended up in Weston and was asked to manage the tree stock, which is basically all of the trees in the cemeteries, the parks, and the allotments. And we surveyed all the trees and then set about creating a work program to address the tree issues. And we also started a planting program as well, because, as I'm sure we'll talk about, Milton Road Cemetery was designed as an arboretum and cemetery. And while there are still some remnants of that Victorian planting, a lot of those trees have been lost, and so we decided, as part of the tree program, to start redeveloping and reintroducing species that would fit into that arboretum. And then when Faye Powell came along as the grounds manager, she had a very wide-ranging talk with me, where we suddenly started talking about my time as an environmental scientist. And she said, we're just starting a climate change working party. I think you might be useful to us. And so in that moment, my whole academic and work life turned full circle. And so I now have a great time working with Weston on both trees and on the climate change working party. And so hopefully we can discuss a few of those things this evening.
Absolutely, and very lucky we are to have you as well, so that's great. And we'll just have to underline that any of the views are your own, because there's a lot going on with trees at the moment. We've got tree questions, I'm sure, that are going to come in about the cherry trees that are on the Boulevard, and I'm sure that we're probably going to be talking about Welbury Hillfort as well. So we've got a lot to discuss, as well as talking about the trees that we look after. And maybe when you're watching at home, you're thinking, actually, I've got some stuff going on with some of my trees, and here we have an expert. So if you're finding that you have a holy tree and not a religious one that you would sit under and gain enlightenment, or at least learn about gravity, but if you've got other things kind of like going on, then now is a good opportunity to be able to talk to somebody about maybe some of the trees that you've got. Maybe you are interested in planting trees. Maybe that's something that you would like to be doing yourself. Maybe you're like my mum, and she plants acorns into pots of soil and then takes them back into the wood and plants them. So maybe you're doing your own bit. They always say, you know, have a child, write a book, or plant a tree. One of those seems counterintuitive to the other, but they say if you want to live forever, then that's one of the best ways to be able to leave your mark upon the world. So if you're thinking about any of those things, then do drop a question into the chat, as we are live at the moment and won't be live later. But if you have any questions for Steve, then do drop them into the chat, and we will do our very, very best to answer them for you. So let us just have a quick conversation about one of the latest assets that Weston Town Council have are now taken care of, which is the Ellenborough Park West. So we're looking at that as being quite a well-being park, a meditative space, a yoga space, a well-being space. We're looking at events that we're going to be doing there. But it is gorgeous in terms of some of the trees that it's got. It's got a badger set there as well, which we're taking care of. But tell us about some of the trees that we can find in Ellenborough Park and what your thoughts are on them.
Well, Ellenborough Park West is quite unique in its aspect, in that it faces almost directly onto the Bristol Channel, and so the majority of the trees in that park are trees that they have to be able to cope with the strong winds and the saline content of the winds. And so a lot of the trees along that west boundary are trees like Quercus ilex, the home oak, or sometimes called the holly oak, which is an evergreen oak, which we see in a lot of our parks, and that's very good at tolerating the weather conditions. And that there are some sycamores there and some limes, and also the Monterey cypress, macrocarpa. There's a really beautiful specimen of that in the center of the park, which has its origins on the west coast of California, obviously, Monterey cypress. And they, as well as providing their intrinsic beauty, they provide a windshield and a kind of microclimate within the park. And of course, there are two. It's also an a site of special scientific interest. There you go. Because there are two plant species in there that are also very rare. yeah, and when we took on that park, of course, it's during the pandemic, and we wanted to create or have a space where there was the element of the natural health service. So even when you walk into a treed area, whether you know it or not, your system starts to relax. Your heart rate slows down a little bit. Your blood pressure drops, and we're primates. We're from the trees, and early man, his earliest interaction with trees were because they were providing him with food and fuel, and so very early on, Homo sapiens got into managing trees for their benefit, and so we have this real deep connection with trees, and they affect us intrinsically, but they also help us on a health level. So you've heard of forest bathing, which is said to originate in Japan. So it's when you go and walk mindfully in an area of trees, and the scents and the phenolic oils from the trees affect us. So we breathe in the scents of the trees. That also helps stimulate or calm the parasympathetic nervous system, and just by being in a location with trees helps our system, because that by stimulating the parasympathetic system, then it takes us out of the stress response, fight or flight, and brings us into a more relaxed space. And then that just allows us to slow down, and it also allows our immune system and our body just to work better. And also there is evidence that if you're in a hospital and you can see a tree from your bed, or even just a plant, you actually heal faster. So there's this connection between trees and our health goes on many levels, and also one of the things that the Climate Change Working Party discussed was that with the pandemic, there's a lot of personal mourning, but there's also a kind of collective grief that's going on, and they wanted us to provide this space for the residents of Weston, so that they have chance to come back into the world in a more gentle way, but also they have a space where they can go and just work through the emotions in a way that's in a place that's intrinsically healing them because of the trees that are around them.
That's amazing. And it's so interesting how that's the case, because also we know that trees, through their whole root system and fungi system, if that's a thing, you'd know, actually heal each other and send water to each other. So tell us about how they look after each other with those root systems.
So trees, they have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhiza fungi, and different trees relate to different mycorrhiza fungi. So they actually their roots will only connect with mycorrhiza that they've evolved to connect with. And what the relationship with the fungi does is so the tree has anchor roots, which are the kind of thick woody roots that hold the tree in place, and then they have this really broad network of filamentous roots, which are the roots that are looking for the nutrients and the moisture that they need to transpire. And then what the relationship with the mycorrhiza fungi does is it increases the surface area that those nutrients and water can be absorbed in. And what the fungi do is they get access to the cellulose and the starch that the trees producing from the photosynthetic process. And so there's this symbiosis. The fungi allow the trees to take up more moisture and nutrients, and the trees provide the nutrients to the fungi. But what is also happening is that those fungi are part of their own network, which is connecting all of the other trees. And so what's been found, there's a lady called Kathleen Wolfe, who's an academic in, I think it's in Vancouver. She's on the west coast of the States. Amazing lady. If you get a chance, look up her website. She talks about all of the things we've just been talking about, how trees affect us. But what she discovered is that the trees will then, if one tree's struggling, that the other trees will actually send nutrients through this network to help that tree. And even to the point that trees that have been cut down, those stumps are still nurturing the younger trees around it by passing the nutrients through what's become known as the wood wide web.
That's a brilliant way of calling it. I love that. I love
that. And there's more recent research is it's not just nutrients that's being passed, is that the trees communicate with each other. So if there's a parasitic invasion, if there's insects attacking trees, then the trees will put in tannin and other chemicals into their leaves to make them less palatable. And what happens is that the trees that are initially being attacked or eaten send messages through the system to the other trees, and it's shown that the other trees start producing the chemicals in their system to make them less palatable before the insects actually get to them. So it reduces the impact that those insects will have on the rest of the wood. And they're only just beginning to kind of understand that it's not just that, it's not just the nutrients, but it's it sounds a little bit hippie, but it's almost like it's a cultural exchange between the trees in the wood. And so that's kind of where our understanding is at the moment. And there's a phrase when you get into professional arboriculture is be a tree professional, not a tree hugger. But the thing is that all tree professionals, whether they admit it or not, are tree huggers. So we try not to anthropomorphize these what are, actual scientific realities, but in some cases they do get anthropomorphized just to make it more accessible to us, because it's hard to believe that that's going on until all of this research is saying, yeah, what the hippies said is true.
And also it sounds like, what you were saying before about, that Japanese art form of kind of like mindfully walking through a forest or walking through a woods, that tree hugging and all of those kinds of things is actually having a really great knock-on effect to our health benefits. Yeah. And the other thing that you said that I found very interesting was when you were talking about grief and how, that the Wellbeing Park in Ellenborough, Wellbeing Park, a really lovely place to go, especially at this time of COVID, as we do have this real collective sense of loss for multiple different reasons. That leads us very nicely really to talking about why the trees were planted as an arboretum in Victorian times, such as having that at Milton Road Cemetery as we have now. Anyone who hasn't managed to see Steve's brilliant narration of the tree film, you just head over to the Western Town Council website and go and find the page on the Milton Road Cemetery, and you'll be able to see this tree film. It's really, really great. But we shall
You're not quite telling the full story there, though, are you, Becky? Because you and Sally actually hijacked me that day, so it's not just my film.
No, basically we went there to have a look at filming some of the trees, and I can't even remember what we were doing there, but I got into a conversation with you, and because I come from a media background of radio and television presenting, I can spot when somebody has some knowledge that would look really great on camera. So before we knew it, the next thing we're creating a film about the trees, and then the next thing I know, it's Sally's saying, right, we'll get drone footage. And so before you know it, now we've got this incredible drone footage of the whole of Milton Road Cemetery, plus this narration and video imagery that's just beautiful. Sally's an incredible cinema photographer. So if you haven't seen this, then do head over to the website and go and have a look with my clunky editing. Go and have a look at that. It's a really, really great film. But let's just talk about grief and trees and Milton Road Cemetery. Why would they have wanted to have had trees in the cemetery at that time in the Victorian times? What was the thinking behind that?
Well, there was a different relationship to death in those days, and they were much more their gravestones and their ornaments, and they're much more what's the right word? I was going to say their ornaments are more ornamental, but you know what I mean. They celebrated death in a, you know, it wasn't something that, you know, it was more frequent. It was a more frequent occurrence. There was a lot more infant mortality. The life expectancy was much shorter then than it is now. And mourning was seen as something that was beneficial and was a normal part of a person's life. And as I understand it, Milton Road was designed, I mean, it used to have a double chapel. So that beautiful chapel was replicated on the other side. And then the architects wanted to create a space where people could come and be with their memories of their relatives, and at that time there were a lot of new trees coming into the country from the explorers in America and China and Australia. So a lot of those trees that we see in there, the cedars and the Luckham oak, and some of the cultivars, the pendant silver lime, and there's an old what was a weeping beech but has kind of reverted. It's got a really amazing structure to it, and so he wanted to create a beautiful space for people to be with their memories and to be able to mourn their loved ones. And so we're really lucky to have such a beautiful cemetery and to have such an amazing basis of the tree collection, really.
It is absolutely beautiful. It's such a lovely area, and I know that lots of people during lockdown, when they've been going out for their exercise, has actually had a profound impact in them, just being able to walk around such a huge site of natural beauty. Also on Western Town Council's website, if you haven't discovered it, there's an actual audio sort of tour but without a map of the people who are in the graves. So some of the people who have been an influence on the structure and the development of Weston as a town. So it tells some of the historical story as well. So that might be something that you want to go and have a little listen to and find out a few historical things about the people who are buried there as well. And it also makes a nice narrative if you're going to go for a walk and have a look around and maybe come across a grave and you want to find out a bit more, then there's some references there as well for some of the graves with the famous people in them. So that's interesting. So there's a lot of sort of controversy that's been coming up about Welbury Hill thought, and obviously it's a bit of a tricky one. What are you feeling is the impact of that? Do you feel, yeah, I'll just leave that to you. What do you feel about that? Because I know there's a lot of people who are worried about the loss of the woodland there, even though it's being counteracted by new tree growth. But just your thoughts on that.
So the clearance around Wilbury Hill Fort was preempted because that is a site of historic interest, and the previous landowner had planted trees as a crop in part of it, and then some of it is were areas where lots of ash is self-sown and regenerated. And it has a unique structure as a fort, and it's in I think it's one of 12 promontory forts in the country. So it's seen as a very special part of our heritage. And the trouble with the trees, what had happened is the land ownership changed, and also there wasn't so much management of the trees, and so a lot of self-sown trees grew, and they started to damage the ramparts of the fort. And at that point, when the fort was surveyed, it was put on the at-risk register. And at that point, there were all sorts of, as far as I can tell, I haven't been deeply involved in it, but I have looked into it enough to see that there has been a progression of reports done to show how to keep the fort and how to address the situation. And in this case, unfortunately, the best way is to remove the trees from the ramparts and what's called the glade, the inside of the fort, so that historical structure can be maintained. And there is going to be a lot of tree loss, but a lot of those trees are ash trees. I think over 700 of those ash trees have got ash dieback. So ash dieback is a disease that affects the structural integrity of the tree. So it's a fungus that gets in through the leaf nodes or through wounds in the tree, and its decay strategy is to take out the part of the wood, the lignin that keeps the wood strong in a tensile way, and that makes the tree then danger. And what we're finding with ash dieback is that there's a kind of 2 to 5 year period where between the tree getting the disease, and if it's going to die, then it dies. But very quickly that tree becomes unclimbable, it becomes unsafe, it can't support a tree surgeon to take the tree down safely. And so all across the Mendips we're having to take down ash trees sooner than most people would like, but because there's actually a real hazard around our roads and our footpaths, and so even if it wasn't an issue, the trees weren't going to be earmarked for felling, those ash trees would have to come down anyway. And so nobody likes to take that number of trees down, and you can see in the council's documents that they have done it in a very strategic way, and they're going to replant trees elsewhere. So it's not ideal, but unfortunately in this case I think it's the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. And that leaves us swiftly onto the Boulevard. So now I don't know how long those cherry trees have been there. I can't remember them not being there. And on those days when they're full of cherry blossom, and then the wind catches them and the cherry blossom moves down the boulevard. So the first thing I thought when I heard this news report was, no! So What's going on? Why do the cherry trees, are they taking them? What's happening there that you know of?
So again, I'm not involved directly. And what I can say is that yes, I mean the Boulevard and also the cherries on the road into Weston, they're an iconic feature of Weston-super-Mare. And so I know that any tree professional would not take a decision like that lightly. And what I have seen is that they're taking the decision because of the condition of the trees. Having trees in the built environment, and particularly in paved areas and roads, it's a really harsh environment for trees. And cherries are susceptible to a lot of diseases. So as I understand it, a lot of the cherries in the Boulevard have got fungal infections. And so when you're assessing trees for management, you look at the condition of the tree, but then you also have to consider the people around the tree. So if those trees weren't in the middle of a footpath or a paved area, then they'd be fine. But we have to take into account risk and people's safety. And what the official statement says is that the risk of those trees shedding a limb or causing an accident is too great, and what the decision has been made to remove them and replace them. So it's not that the trees are going. I mean, they are going, but they're being replaced, and it's part of what we call urban forestry or tree management. Different trees have different. It's not a very nice term, but what they call useful life expectancy, and cherries they have quite a short life expectancy, really. So I mean, we're in the middle of a very fashionable tree planting time. Everybody wants to plant trees, and I can remember back when I were a young lad, back in 1973, it was plant a tree in 73, plant some more in 74. And back in those days, I lived in a rural Lincolnshire village, and we planted cherry trees on the village green. And my partner will tell you, it wasn't just cherry trees, but my partner will tell you every time we go there, we drive past that open space to see those trees. But the cherries have gone, because in that, what's that now, 40, 50 years, the cherries have gone through their lifespan, and they're being replaced by young trees. And essentially that's what's happening on the Boulevard. And it's just providing succession in the landscape. It's not it's something that it's just part of the natural lifespan of a tree. And I'm sure that the people involved will be planting those trees. There's lots of new designs for tree pits in urban areas, so that trees stand a lot better chance of lasting longer, that they don't get knocked around as much, and that there aren't people digging through their roots every other year and that sort of thing. So I'm sure that, I know that the replacement process has been discussed for a long time. So I'm sure that the new trees are going to be planted in the best way possible, so that future generations are going to have fond memories of cherry blossom blowing down the Boulevard.
And then we can go onto certain Facebook posts and with pictures and going, it's not the same as it was before 2 o'clock. Oh, then again, it would be more Somerset accent, wouldn't it? It's not as good as it was. Okay, great. Thank you for that. That's made me feel less uncomfortable about it. Climate change. What? Could you just fix that? I mean, just while you're here. I'll leave it there. Climate change, trees, go.
Thank you. Wow. Climate change. So it's not a new thing. It might seem that it's a new thing, but when I were a young lad, you know, back in the 80s, environmental science was quite a new subject to be studying, but we already knew that climate change was going on then. We've known it's been happening, scientifically proven, for 50 years, but it's not a threat that is doesn't appear immediate and imminent, because you can't really see what's going on. And nowadays, of course, we can see with wildfires and the storms and the flooding, you know, and the weather patterns that weren't happening even 40 or 50 years ago. So it's partly to do with our emissions, and I think the latest estimate is that we've cut down 40 to 50% of the trees in the world. And trees are central to the carbon cycle, the water cycle. They generate weather systems, they produce oxygen, they sequester carbon, and when you take half of them away, it's not it shouldn't be a surprise that all of those systems are going to start wobbling around a bit. And that's, I mean, I'm not being flippant at all. I'm just trying to give an easily accessible view of part of the origin. And of course, then we're exacerbating that problem by the emissions that we produce in our daily lives and through industry, through vehicle emissions, through agriculture, you know. And the more we look into it, and the more we're beginning to realize what we've always known, is that we're not treating the planet in the best way, and that we've got to do something very quickly to change it if we don't want things to get dramatically worse. And that's, you know, there's a climate crisis has been announced by lots of councils, and particularly Weston-super-Mare Town Council is part of that, and the town council want to get themselves to carbon neutrality within the next 10 years, and they're doing it on all the fronts that we all need to, in terms of our travel, our food, you know, food production, and providing food within the community, bringing all of the making sure that we source our resources from sustainable and preferably local places, looking at generating our own electricity through solar power, and looking at things like ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps, and so that we can take those emissions down. And actually now the thinking is that carbon neutrality isn't enough. We actually need to go and aim for carbon negativity, so that we're actually taking more carbon out than we're using. And trees are part of that. Trees, they're not the answer, but they're part of the answer, because they will help rebalance the systems. And, you know, if you want a machine that's going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and produce oxygen and help intercept water and reduce pollution, the tree is there, and it's the best one. And so that's why there's so many planting schemes, and why governments are saying we're going to plant millions and billions of trees. But the trees that are doing the most work are the trees that are standing. And that's something that seems to get, from my point of view, from the work that I do in terms of dealing with planning applications and development, and also just tree management, actually keeping semi-mature and mature trees standing is just as, if not more important than planting lots of whips. So whips are 1 to 2 year old trees. So if you're felling a tree that's 50 or 100 or 150 years old and you're replacing it with a 1 meter long twig, it's not going to be doing the same amount of carbon sequestration or oxygen production as the trees that are standing. And so it's looking at it in a holistic way. You know, keep the mature trees standing wherever you can, and get as many young trees in as you can, and do what North Somerset are doing in the Boulevard, provide situations where the trees that you're going to plant are going to last for a long time. And that's hopefully what my industry and the politicians and the world are going to understand and work towards. Because even with these big planting schemes, so there's quite a famous planting scheme in New York where they realized that they were losing all of their street trees, so they decided to plant 1 million trees over, I can't remember what it was, 5 or 10 years. And there's a way of assessing the amount of canopy cover, so the amount of area of the land that's covered by the tree canopies. And even though they were planting 1 million trees, the canopy cover reduced. And this has been found the same in Santa Monica in America and other cities, that it's, even though a lot of tree planting is happening on public land, a lot of the tree loss is happening in private gardens. And those private gardens make up approximately 70% of our tree stock. And so when people take down a tree to put a driveway in the front of their house, that's another tree gone. Or whenever somebody, the most vulnerable time for trees is when a house changes ownership or when there's a new development. And that's when we lose a lot of our trees. And so it's quite shocking how poorly trees are protected in this country, actually. And we lose a lot of trees. And it takes a lot of dedicated tree officers, a lot of time and stress to actually try and stand up for trees that people want to take down. And it's partly to do with development, and it's partly to do with the kind of current idea that we all want unlimited sunlight in our back gardens or whatever. And there's a thing in the human psyche is that we can't, or we struggle to appreciate that trees last multiple lifetimes. We only look at things in the here and now and in what we see as our lifetime, but a tree can be there for 20 generations and more, you know, and it's trying to educate people in that way, and trying to get people to understand the value of trees. And even for developers, I mean, if houses in tree-lined roads are 17 or 18%, have a value that is increased by 17 or 18% just because those trees are there. And if you can develop a piece of land and retain the trees, actually you're going to get more money back. But what is often the case is that those trees are seen as a problem because they get in the way of where they're going to store their building materials or whatever it is. So it's trying to we need to try and to get people to understand that it's not just kind of woo-woo stuff about trees, that they have their own value, and there are ways now that that we try to value trees and and I once upon a time I thought I would never really get into this, and how we do it is we put a monetary value on the services that those trees produce. And so at the moment, the two main ones are one called CAVAT, which is, I forgot what it means now, capital asset value for amenity trees. And so that's, you can hear my my beautiful assistant.
You nearly got away with that completely.
Anyway, so that's a way for assessing the value, the monetary value of trees in an urban landscape. So it's not just about the carbon it's sequestering and the oxygen it's producing. It's about the health benefits, the amenity benefits, the cultural benefits, and there's a system that you measure the tree, and it's about the size of the tree, the density of the population, and how visible the tree is, and that gives the tree a monetary value. And so if someone's going to put a road through some trees, you can say, right, you're going to take down 10 trees, and in Bristol they multiply that number and then they put a value on it. Or you can say, right, this tree is worth £175,000. And it's done in a scientific way, so you can actually demonstrate to the engineers, this is the actual value of this tree. So we want mitigation to that standard. We want to plant trees either within your development or your system, and so that we're going to not only replace it but enhance the scheme. And there are schemes in London where actually they've looked at that value, and they've worked out how to increase that value over time. And so trees are retained on site, that value is put into the site, but then the developers also pay for tree planting around the district so that the whole area gets improved. So that's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it is by putting a value on what are called the ecosystem services the tree provides. So how much, I just said, if you wanted a machine that could do these things, the tree is the thing. So what you do instead is you say, okay, if we've got a machine, how much would it cost to sequester a kilogram of carbon? How much would it cost to intercept X grams of pollution? How much would it cost to produce oxygen? How much would it cost to intercept rainfall? And there are ways of, so again, you measure the tree, and then there is a system whereby a database will tell you what the value of that tree is in terms of all of the services that it's producing. And that was developed by the US Forestry Service, and it's called iTree Eco. And you can it's I think it's still free. You can, and I'm in the process of doing this with Weston's trees so that we can demonstrate what the value of their trees are. But also there is another open source system which I know we're going to talk about our connection with the Civic Society, and part of what the Civic Society have been doing with the trees around Weston is they're interested in the street trees, the trees in the parks, and they want to, one of the things they'd like to do is to be able to create a map of Weston's public realm trees. And there's actually an open space, an open source system called TreeZilla. And they want to become the biggest tree map in the country. So, and I went on there this afternoon and plotted our silver leaf line. Do you remember the big, huge tree in the middle of the cemetery that we stood under? So I plotted that one on, and from the survey that I did 10 years ago, I just took the size, the measurements of the trees, so that they'll be slightly bigger now because there's 10 years more growth. And so I've plotted it on their map, and with those measurements, that tree is providing £141 a year's worth of savings in avoided runoff, the carbon dioxide it's sequestered, the carbon it's removed from the atmosphere, and the water intercepted, and also the air quality improved. And so when we, as we move forward with our discussions with the civic society, and hopefully lots of other people, then that might be a way to go forward to plot the trees around the parks and the streets of Weston-super-Mare, and then it's available for everyone to see. You could go onto Treezilla now, and there will be a link popping up, and you go and look in the middle of Milton Road Cemetery, and there is the silver line, and it shows those values, and then we just add that, and we'll start to build up an understanding of the value of trees in Weston-super-Mare and all of the amazing services that they provide for us.
And is that something somebody can do if they've got trees in their own garden? Can they go onto Treezilla and add their own trees?
Yeah. So so you need to measure the stem diameter or the stem girth. So I've got I should have been prepared for this.
All right. I believe
so
you, don't worry.
if you're doing lots of them, you can get a girth and diameter tape. So one side just gives you is a normal measurement, and then on the other side it converts the girth into the diameter.
Okay.
But you can go out with your mum's sewing measure and just measure the girth, and then you can make an estimate of how tall the tree is and how wide the canopy is, and then at what point is the first branch of the tree. So when you measure the girth, it's called diameter at breast height. Now I'm a short person, and so it's that breast height in the tree industry is 1.5 meters. So instead of being there on me, it's there. So I measure the tree at this.
It'll be over the top of my head, Steve, so I won't worry about that.
Yeah,
there we go. It'll be all right. We had a question came in from Johnny, who is Friends of Grove Park, Johnny. And he was saying, can you comment on true carbon sequestration of trees compared with wild grasses or flowers that are not mown? So the ones that are not mown, wild grasses and wildflowers that are not mown.
That's a great question, Johnny. Thank you.
In a word, no.
So, well, I can give a few pointers. I don't know if we haven't got any specific links to send out for this, but so I think what John is talking about is it's not just trees that are photosynthesizing, and it's not just trees that are sequestering carbon, and natural grasslands and wildflower meadows have a huge role to play in carbon sequestration, as they do in biodiversity gain. And we're beginning to understand that peat bogs have an even bigger part to play in sequestering carbon. All of the natural world is doing it, and that's part of it's an aspect of the rewilding movement. Let me and even, I mean, we talked about terminology and some words, but even rewilding is just debated about whether it should be rewilding or wilding. It's like, was the wild stuff there before or not? Anyway, so all of those, so it ties into a bigger debate about rewilding, and if the council doesn't cut its grass, is it because the council wants to save money, and is it actually doing something? Well, yes, it is. When last year when we made the film in the cemetery was we had taken the decision not to cut the grass, and partly we already knew that there was a seed bank of wildflowers there, because every spring there is a carpet of primroses across certainly the majority of the upper section and part of the lower section. But what we found when we didn't cut the grass, that there was all sorts of plant species that grew up that we wouldn't normally have seen because they get cut down. And so we had oxeye daisies, we had lady's leek, which we didn't even know what it was when we saw it. There's evening primrose, there's scabiosa, there are valerians, there's both valerians, the white and the red. And they are all helping in the sequestration, but they're also improving the biodiversity. And so part of rewilding and part of the new green infrastructure strategy that North Somerset is consulting everybody on at the moment is about allowing different mowing regimes in roadside verges and parks to happen, so that we can encourage wildflowers and grasses to grow and to help us sequester that carbon, but also to improve the biodiversity and the connectivity. We're starting to discuss how we improve connectivity, because it's not just Weston Town Council that manages open spaces, it's North Somerset. There are the hospitals, churchyards, housing association sites, plus all of the private realm. And so it's getting this information out and letting people know what they can do in their own backyard, but also so they understand why all of a sudden the grass isn't being cut in the cemetery, or they've got what look like weeds growing down the side of the road, but actually there's a lot of biodiversity going on in that verge.
Great stuff.
Have I got anywhere near answering what you asked me? But,
and if you didn't, you did a wonderful political attempt and sidestepped it. No, I don't think you did it. You totally answered it. Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left, would you believe? What are you going to kick yourself that we didn't get to talk about? What do people need to know?
That they can do something wherever they are. You don't have to have an oak tree in your garden. Most of us don't have gardens that are big enough to have oak trees, but you can grow trees in containers. You can grow fruit trees in containers. You can grow any tree in a container as long as you look after it, and sometimes you're going to have to prune it because its roots aren't going to be able to develop. You can grow herbs or flowers or anything to add to the biodiversity, and as Johnny pointed us to, that all of those things are helping both sequester carbon and improve biodiversity gain. And we talk about connectivity, and one thing that I must say is when I talked about this with Dr. Agassiz, and I was talking about hedgerows and trees and connectivity in the local environment, and he said, well, tonight I'm going out to look at my moth trap and I'm expecting to see moths there from North Africa. So where does your connectivity fit in that? And it's about having a diverse and biodiverse landscape, which includes everything from trees down to grasses, that accommodates all of the wildlife that comes through Weston-super-Mare, because Weston-super-Mare is on a migration highway for moths and butterflies all the way up to ospreys. So we can all do something, and just plant something in your garden, in a pot, on your windowsill, and hopefully it's something that will attract pollinators or birds or some other form of wildlife and help the planet.
Steve Clark, what a wonderful place to end. Thank you ever so much for joining us, and for everybody that managed to watch, and everyone that's going to be watching this, as we're going to be putting it up on YouTube. It'll also be on the Town Council's website as well as the Facebook page. So if you found this interesting, do share and let other people know, because it's really important so that we can all do our bit to look after the planet and your own well-being. So you can be, even if you don't care about the planet, you can care about yourself, because it certainly does a lot to boost your own immune system as well, which is very important at this time. Steve Clark, thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody at home, and hope to see you again when we bring in a panel next week. Well, next month, we're bringing in a whole panel of wildlife experts. So I'm really going to have my work cut out, trying to control the crazy enthusiasm about our wildlife. So we're going to be talking about wildlife next time. Thank you ever so much, and have a really good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky.